Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is the 19th lecture in my 20-part lecture series on the history of ethics. And today I'd like to make a transition in the thinking of the 19th century to talk to you about the work and writing and some of the major ideas that come out of the work and writing of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. And in my next lecture, I'm going to be turning to the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. And what I see happening in both the work of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche is setting the stage for a new way of looking at the challenges of existence, both in terms of our thoughts on how to have a good life and how to be good people. And in some sense, they are the roots of what I would call existential philosophies focusing on existence and the conditions of our existence. And in another way, I think both of them sort of set the stage for what will come to be known as postmodernism. And so I want to, before I jump into the ideas and details of Kierkegaard's thoughts on existence, I'd like to start by offering some sort of general remarks on what I think Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are doing in the 19th century to set up what comes to be known as existential philosophy, sometimes thought of as existentialism, in the 20th century, and also their connection that I'm arguing is present to postmodernism in the 20th century. So let me talk about the idea of existential philosophy. It's kind of a broad umbrella of a bunch of different thinkers that primarily exist in the 20th century, but have these kind of roots and antecedents in the 19th century in the work of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. But we can say maybe a few things that unites this umbrella group. It's not as tight-knit a group as we might say utilitarians are, or Kantians are, or social contract theorists are. It's a looser knit group than that, but still we can hopefully meaningfully say a few things that are general trends within all these different thinkers, primarily again in the 20th century, that are kind of lumped onto or under or typically put under this umbrella term of philosophers of existence or existential philosophers. So I think that the place to start maybe is kind of the realization that the philosophies of existence focus on the experience of the concrete individual. And this is something that many of my students sort of have been anticipating coming for a long time. And that's because I think that living in the 20th and now 21st century, we have a strong sort of lens on life that is heavily individualistic. I don't think that's an accident. I think there's a good way to understand this historically. And so what's happening in philosophies of existence in the 19th and then 20th century is there's sort of a picking up on, there's sort of a finger being put on the pulse of culture and seeing how the individualism that has been reborn in the modern era and has expanded throughout the modern has led to a new set of challenges that confront the concrete individual in the 19th and 20th century, or what I'll begin to call sort of the postmodern age, the age after the modern. And let me focus on this term concrete individual just for a second. You know, the history of philosophy, especially as we've explored it here in this lecture series on ethics, has focused on the attempt to find wisdom that corresponds to a human life in general. I'm actually sympathetic to that, as I've said in other places. I think that as human beings, it is appropriate for us to compare notes on life to try to find something about just being a human. Now, that speaks to the way it might be historically conditioned in a certain moment. I think that's going to be relevant here in a second, but I also want to add another layer, and that is that we can also sort of swap notes with the figures of history, the philosophers of history, the religious texts and writings of history, the literature of history, to look for more what we might call archetypally human issues that seem to transcend space and time in some sense. Even if we don't go so far as to saying that they're somehow essentially human issues, we might say that these are issues that seem to confront human beings across time and space in different cultural settings. And so philosophy, as it's existed throughout most of its 2,500-year period since emerging in the axial age moment, has focused on the attempt to find wisdom about being a human being in general, or about what we might here call being a human in the abstract, right? Sort of, like I'm this human and you're that human, but we're both human. So what can we say about living a human existence in this kind of abstract way? However, as I've begun to imply and develop for you, something has really developed in the modern, right? In many societies, it's been this sort of expansion of the experience of freedom, political, social, and economic freedom for many of us. I know that's not perfect, but this has expanded largely as an experiment throughout the modern. And because it has, there's going to be an increasing focus in these 19th and 20th century existential philosophers on the life of the concrete individual that lives in a specific moment of time, right? And the kinds of choices that this individual is going to have to make within the context of being maybe more free than we've ever been before. Let's drop back for a second and tie these last couple of lectures to something we said in the very first lecture in the series, and that is that for much of human history, I think you can make a fairly compelling case that when we were hunters and gatherers, or when we lived in villages, or when we lived in early city-state cultures that were dominated by state-sanctioned religious orders, that your place of birth, whether you were a male or you were a female, or whether you were born to a wealthy family, or like most people born to a family without any social, political, or economic power, that these things determined your identity and your role and much of your existence, right? And so one of the things that has been very, very recently experimented with, particularly in what I would call classical liberal capitalist societies in the industrialized Western nations, which has gone increasingly global in some respects throughout the 20th century, has been an experiment in freedom, an experiment in new levels of liberty. And I just, let me take a moment here and pause and just say that, especially at the moment that I'm delivering and recording this lecture, we're seeing a time in which a lot of people are raising serious and valuable, I think, critiques of society and the ways in which people are still not as free as they should be. And yet, with that said, in the larger historical sweep, I hope that you could charitably see how I could make the case that within classically liberal societies, where liberty is one of the primary values, even though it is imperfectly distributed, it is a new kind of experiment in the distribution of freedom for the individual. It tends to be distributed unfairly to individuals that are male, that are a certain color, that have certain economic privilege. Duly noted, and that's an important critique, I would say, of the ways in which classical liberalism and capitalist societies have manifested. However, I want to talk broadly about sort of the underpinning philosophies of existence and the implications of classical liberalism and capitalism on broadening, at least, and continuing to, especially if these current critiques are successful, continuing to broaden this experience of human liberty in such a way that the human individual is no longer determined in the same way by their place of birth, as male or female, as rich or poor, as black or white, etc., as to what they're going to do with their existence. And I think that we have a kind of a somewhat overly simple sort of way of championing that. And don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking it. I think it's a worthy experiment that ought to continue to be expanded. But I want to, again, sort of draw out one of the challenging implications of living in a time where we're seeing kind of unprecedented levels of human freedom. And that is that the concrete individual born into a specific moment of history, while still a human, right, has this element of individuality. And because the concrete individual has this element of uniqueness and individuality, and because these concrete individuals, especially in the 19th, 20th, and now 21st century, are born into this experiment in unprecedented levels of economic and social choice in terms of what you want to do with your life and how you want to behave in life, there is a kind of a unique challenge, a unique kind of existential challenge that's brought on by this existential condition that we're inhabiting. The concrete individual has to find a way to be true to itself, or to use the plural, the concrete individuals have to find a way to be true to themselves in the context of this, again, expanding but unprecedented experiment in choice and in freedom. And as much as we like to sort of champion that and say that that's just a great thing, let's not pretend that that's not a serious challenge in and of itself. The philosophies of existence are going to focus on the way in which choice and freedom manifest as a kind of a burden, as Jean-Paul Sartre will say in the 20th century, somebody who stands on the shoulders, I would say, of the figures like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, to live a much more sort of famous and almost rock star lifestyle, promoting some of these same ideas for which Kierkegaard and Nietzsche received so much flack and died such short and unhappy after such short and unhappy lives. Sartre is going to be able to proclaim in the middle of the 20th century after World War II that life, this freedom comes with this burden. And he'll become very famous for describing it this way, that is kind of like a rock that we carry up a hill. Camus has a very famous bit of writing on this, that we carry this rock up the hill much like Sisyphus did in ancient mythological tales. And, we get up to the top of the hill and it just rolls back down again. And now this brings together a lot of things. Let me try to bring them out. Freedom sounds good. But when you realize that you are free to choose your existence, and when you realize that there is no playbook for your unique individual existence, while in certain moments you might celebrate this opportunity to express yourself in some uniquely, authentically individual way, you will also occasionally experience the sort of crushing weight that manifests because you are free and because you are unique, and you see that there just aren't any formulae, right, that are going to determine for you. There's no formula that can tell you how you should live your life and how you ought to express your choices in life. And so you go out onto this dance floor of existence, and you have evolved to be a creature that in some sense wants to follow. That's been part of my argument throughout the lecture series, certainly back in the beginning, that Homo sapiens think, we all know that that's really definitive of our being, but most of us don't make of that capability what we imagine we do, because most of us are not philosophically or Socratically awakened to an examined existence, and we maybe not only haven't begun that journey, but we haven't certainly played that out in any significant way. And so we end up being creatures with this incredible cognitive ability, who largely just use this cognitive ability to store the teachings of the culture that we're born into. And so whether it was in a hunting and gathering context, or in a village context, or in a state-sanctioned hieratic city-state context, or whether it's even in this moment, human beings have evolved to be much more of a sort of a herd animal, to use the language of Nietzsche, or a kind of a crowd animal, to use the language of Kierkegaard. And so when you confront the concrete human individual with this unprecedented level of choice, well, you induce a kind of an anxiety that we might call a kind of an existential angst or an existential anxiety. This is another theme that I think shows up over and over again amongst the philosophers of existence, the existential philosophers. And that is that, there's a kind of a background anxiety and stress that we feel, particularly in the late modern, or what I want to increasingly call the postmodern moment that we're inhabiting. And it's very much brought on by the sort of historical locatedness of being concrete, unique individuals in this moment. There's an anxiety associated with not being sure what to do. You know, and again, ironically, some of this, right, has been induced by the progress of the modern. We saw science emerge, and that was sort of definitive of the modern in terms of philosophy and ethics. But the irony there was that as much progress as science has produced, it's yielded a kind of a equal and parallel crisis with regard to the way we used to feel more comfortable with our answers historically, and the way we used to just sort of feel comfortable setting into these roles historically that told us how to live a good life and told us how to be good to one another. And yet what we've seen unpack continually throughout the modern is this kind of crisis, as I've called it in this lecture series, about how to live good lives and about how to be good to one another. These things haven't gotten more clear. In some sense, they've gotten less clear. And so what's brewing, right, in the late 19th and the 20th century and on into this moment is this kind of perfect storm of unprecedented levels of freedom and unprecedented levels of uncertainty with regard to the meanings and purposes of our existences and these questions that have characterized the history of ethics. You know, what does it mean to live a good life, and what does it mean to be a good person? And so many of us, right, may not have the language to talk about this, but can still very much relate to the sort of background, you know, radiation in the universe, you know, to use a metaphor here, this background anxiety in our existential condition in this time in which we're living. And it's tied to the burden and the heaviness of choice and freedom, which is unprecedented in terms of the way we confront it. And it's also combining with this kind of unprecedented uncertainty. And so, as Camus will put it in the 20th century, you know, this leads to a kind of an absurdity, right, in the existential condition of human beings, particularly in the 20th century, or by the 20th century. And the absurdity, I think, that Camus is writing about here underlines that we really want, you know, two things. Once our basic needs and sort of Maslow's hierarchy are taken care of, you know, we really want two things primarily in life, Camus would argue. We want to be connected to each other in meaningful and loving ways. We want to have a genuine kind of intimacy. And we also want some sense of coherence and meaning and purpose and understanding about all that. And yet we live in a moment where relationships are changing and evolving and difficult to maintain, in part because there are so many choices that we're confronted with in the 20th and 21st century. If I could just sort of use this shorthand of in this postmodern moment where we're living, you know, we're confronted by a kind of an uncertainty with regard to the nature of relationships that we want to engage in, and that has produced a kind of a destabilization of relationships, you know, and in some ways this is good, right? Because we probably used to just be stuck in relationships that maybe weren't that fulfilling, but we thought it was our duty to be stuck in those relationships. Well, now we have all this freedom, and that's yay, good. But it's also maybe harder than ever to maintain kind of intimacy and stability in relationships than ever before. And yet that's one of the things that humans, you know, find really important. And so we have this kind of absurdity in our condition. One of the things we want most is one of the things that is destabilized in this moment of our existence. And let's add to that one of the other things we want most, according to Camus, we want some understanding. We want some coherent account of reality that offers us a sense of direction and purpose and value. And yet we live in a period of time in which increasingly the more we know, the less we understand about any kind of ultimate purpose or value or direction for our existence. And, you know, maybe here's a moment where I'll sort of stand up on this exploration of Camus' idea of absurdity. We want, you know, loving relationships, and we want, you know, certainty and understanding, and we live in a time that frustrate both. Let's go ahead and use this to sort of maybe flesh out a little bit more of an understanding of what it means to live in a postmodern moment. Okay, in some sense, the word is a nice place to start. not very creative, right? But we live in an after the modern moment. Okay, well, what was the modern? Well, the modern was characterized by the rise of science, and particularly in the early phases of that, I think characterized by a kind of an optimism that we would be able to discover a kind of a final theory of reality, and that this understanding would be so powerful that we would be able to manifest more utopian societies as science continued to advance. And look, that's a little overly simple, but yet I think that that is somewhat of the spirit of the modern that has unfolded, sometimes characterized by the word scientism, this kind of almost irrational hope or faith in science itself that it would provide somehow ultimate answers. And let's go ahead and point out that it just really hasn't played out that way, because as impressive as it has been in terms of what we have discovered and what we continue to discover about life, some kind of final theory of existence has eluded us. Supposedly even Einstein died pursuing some kind of unified field theory about reality. And maybe we will find one, maybe it's right around the corner, but I think what I'm saying is that we live in a moment in which we are wrestling with the possibility that maybe there isn't a unified reality for us to theorize about, or maybe we're just not equipped with enough intelligence and enough drive to be able to understand whatever possible unified reality might be out there with any of our scientifically generated theoretical frameworks. And so instead, what we're left with in this moment is this kind of interesting accumulation of quantum theory and Einsteinian theory and Newtonian theory that each level explains and predicts things very differently. The microcosmic level, the level of roughly our senses where we shoot rockets to other planets, and then this sort of macrocosmic level, and yet we still haven't found a way through science to bring it all together. And so one sense of postmodernity is maybe a kind of a considering that the modern effort to find a unified field theory of even reality itself might have been a bit quixotic, it might have been a bit of a fool's errand, it might be something that is forever beyond us, or it's just possible that we won't find it because it's not possible, either because of our own limitations or maybe because of the somehow flux nature of reality itself. But of course, it's actually even worse than that, right? Because the way we've talked about the modern in this history of ethics is to not only focus on the way in which science has produced a kind of a progress of understanding that I'm now fleshing out as a sort of an irony. The more we know, the less we know in some sense. The more we build up our theoretical understanding, the more we get sort of collisions between different paradigms, if I can borrow the phrase of Thomas Kuhn. And also the more we see the edge of mystery somewhat expand throughout the modern, and maybe nowhere is that more apparent than with regard to morality itself and the history of ethics. As we said several lectures ago in this series, to live in the 19th and 20th and now 21st century is to live in the era where many of us have kind of lost faith in what were and this is me pulling some language from some of the literature around postmodernity, we've lost faith in the master narratives. We've lost faith in the sort of one theory of existence that tells us how to live well and how to be good. And we're coming to grips with the possibility that we may never have them. I mean, what we've seen throughout even the modern, right, is that we've seen the emergence of things like social contract theory and Humean, ethics based on disinterested sentiments and empathy, and Kant's attempt to defend absolute moral truth kind of come crashing down. But even his attempt to generate a kind of a objectivity-based and rationality-based version of ethics seems imperfect. And most recently, we've seen utilitarian moral theory, which is plausible as it is in some of its very intuitive insights, and as practically valuable as it may be in certain contexts, is of course far from perfect and has been heavily, heavily criticized. And so where does that leave us? Well, again, I think that something that's happening in the 19th century, especially in the work of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, which then blossoms out into the 20th century, is this kind of postmodern realization that the attempt to find a theory of reality and a theory of morality continually fails, and it might just continue to fail in the sense that we may never have one. Now, again, we can't say that, right? From the kind of epistemically limited perspective of a moment of history, we can't say we'll never have one. But what we are wrestling with, I would say, in the 19th and 20th century is we're wrestling with the possibility that we may not have one. And there seems to have been in what Nietzsche would call this metaphysical speculative impulse on the part of the human and this big brain of the human. We have for as long as we've been around kind of sought after, right, some kind of overarching narrative that brought coherence to our existence and direction, and offered direction in terms of significance and purpose to our existence and meaning to our existence. And you and I live in a time where we've become maybe less optimistic about that, not only in terms of our theories of reality, but particularly with regard to our theories of morality. And that's why I've argued in earlier lectures that we see a kind of a collapse away from absolutistic, one theory, answers all questions, to these kinds of more nihilistic positions like relativism. And we do that, I've argued, largely because we don't really understand what we're committing to there when we give up on the search for wisdom about how to live a good human life and how to be good to one another. But in some sense, what I'm saying now is that we live in a moment that has really almost, because of what it hasn't given us, it almost feeds into this ennui, this kind of tiredness, this kind of despair, and this kind of tendency to collapse down into an overly simple and unhelpful position like, well, everybody's got an opinion, so let's just agree to disagree. Again, as much as we can agree to disagree, let's do so. But there are so many things we cannot agree to disagree about. Okay, so back to the thing I want to focus on today, which does, I hope, kind of bring in a lot of the threads from other lectures. We are inhabiting this moment that I'm now describing as a kind of after the modern or postmodern moment, in which we're wrestling with the possibilities that we won't have that one overarching narrative or theory or story of existence, not only not about reality, but certainly not about morality and values. And that is, to be honest, a scary thing to confront. As Nietzsche will describe it, in some sense, we are living in the moment where we are peering into the abyss of deep space, and we're seeing the possibility that it just doesn't care whether we're here or not. And that's sort of metaphorical in Nietzsche's own sort of way of writing for staring into the deep uncertainty of existence in this postmodern moment. And if you now add unprecedented level of freedom of choice to unprecedented levels of uncertainty, you get the perfect storm that confronts the concrete individual in this historical moment with some new existential challenges on how to live in this moment well, and how to think about treating each other well in this kind of moment. And so we get a kind of we almost inherit from this moment a kind of an anxiety and a stress that ultimately, for Camus, and I want to tread very lightly here, says that, leads to this realization that to be or not to be becomes the question when you peer deeply enough into this abyss. A while ago, I kind of made an offhand reference to the myth of Sisyphus in the writings of Camus, and I connected it to Sartre's idea of sort of carrying the boulder, the burden of our freedom in this postmodern moment. In some sense, right, to flesh that out a little bit more, if we are really uncertain about ever arriving at final answers with regards to our purpose and why we're here, one of the things that we're confronting as we sort of stare into this abyss of deep space and this possibility of meaninglessness is just that we're going to roll the boulder all the way to the hill. We're going to do all this work to think this through, and all that's going to happen is the boulder is going to roll its way to the bottom of the hill again, because none of these answers are going to last. And so what does it mean to live in the moment where we're confronting that all that we're doing may be for naught? You know, at some point the sun is going to blow up. It's a star and it's got a life cycle and it's going to blow up. And if we haven't solved certain, you know, space travel problems by that moment, then humans are going to be gone. And everything that we're going to do, to paraphrase some writing of Bertrand Russell in the earliest 20th century, is going to be buried beneath the rubble of a galaxy or a solar system in collapse at that moment. Now, look, admittedly, these are dark thoughts, but that's why I'm, you know, using language like anxiety and despair, and all of these are common themes in the philosophers of existence that are talking about this in the 19th and especially in the 20th century, as this becomes just sort of more and more obvious, right? And why in the 20th century? Well, because all of that hoped for progress brought to you by science produced, you know, some of the most destructive conflicts and weapons that humans have ever seen in the 20th century, particularly ending in that kind of symbolic and tragic moment of the dropping of the atomic bombs on entire cities. You know, is this where the march of science brought us? You know, one of the things we're wrestling with here, right, is this kind of this notion that all this work is going to potentially cause us to be our own activities, to be the meteor strike in the 6th major extinction on the planet. And so in the face of all that, you know, a lot of people are genuinely asking these tough questions like, do I want to bring children into this mix? And what is the point of being given this existential condition? And hence the question of to be or not to be. Now, I want to be very clear about something. I want to be honest, right, and deal with sort of the darker implications of living in this moment, because I think we sort of have to move through that in an honest way. But I also want to be clear, I do that so that we have the best chance to move through that. If we confront the despair and anxiety of the historical moment that we live in, maybe we won't be overcome by it and pulled down into a choice not to be. But, you know, you can make a pretty good statistical argument that more humans are giving their lives or losing their lives to something like despair and suicide than to all violent crime and war, which is, if that's even close to true, that's incredible, right? I mean, that should be incredibly determining. And in some sense, I'm using that as a kind of a loose argument for, you know, this is the analysis of the historical moment in which we live that is honest. And I know I'm not sort of emphasizing the upsides of the moment we live in. I mean, I do think there are many, and I don't want to neglect them, but these are the themes that the philosophers of existence are going to call out and sort of challenge us with. Can you look at some of the darker implications of the moments that we live in here and not take, as Nietzsche would say, a kind of a unjustified optimistic outlook? Can you, and I'll borrow this phrase right from Nietzsche, I think, kind of embrace a tragic optimism? Can you find a way through despair and anxiety that's a part of this existential moment without just kidding yourself with easy answers here? And I want to go ahead and develop just a little bit more in terms of Camus' response to this idea that he puts forth very boldly in the 20th century, that we live in a moment where to be or not to be, to bring kids into this or not, and to continue to push the boulder up the hill or not, becomes a serious question in this moment. And I want to echo Camus and say that I think that any dignity that we can experience in life is going to be generated by our willingness to say yes to the challenge of pushing this boulder up the hill. And that's how he ends that famous essay of the myth of Sisyphus, where he says, we have to imagine Sisyphus happy, right? We have to imagine ourselves capable of pushing this boulder because that is our life, and choosing, in some sense, to be honestly looking at the possibility that this is our existence, right? And I also just want to say that those of you who are familiar with the despair and anxiety that might be associated with this moment of existence, this doesn't mean something's wrong with you. I mean, I've always taken a kind of a strange comfort in the darker themes that most existential philosophers are dwelling upon here. These themes of despair and anxiety and confronting the nihilistic abyss of deep space and the potential meaninglessness of existence and the possibility that we'll never know the absolute truth. In some sense, I take a kind of a comfort in knowing that when I am overcome by stress and when I am overcome by anxiety and despair in certain moments of my own existence, that doesn't mean I'm broken. That doesn't mean that something is wrong with me. That in some sense, that means that my evolutionary mechanisms are meeting with a new kind of challenge. And I'm being maybe honest enough about that challenge to confront the underlying stresses that come with that, the anxieties and the uncertainties that come with that, and the sort of heaviness of this challenge of existing in this moment that at times overwhelms me and overwhelms many of us and brings on despair. In some sense, there's a bit of a beautiful solution right in this recognition that I'm reading this and these existential philosophers like Camus, and I'm finding my company, I'm finding my people, I'm finding my connectedness to others. Even though we're all confronting this as concrete, unique individuals, there is still a kind of a camaraderie to be found in the way in which each one of us does have to do the same thing. Each one of us does have to confront the uniqueness of our existence and the uncertainties that that brings in a certain moment of history. Now, one more, layer of irony here is that given the evolutionary mechanisms that we bring, the metaphysical speculative tendencies that we bring, as Nietzsche will talk about, and bringing this kind of social mammalian hardware to the game, if some of us are honest enough about this moment that we live in to confront the uncertainties and the lack of guarantees and the challenge of being a unique individual is harder than we like to imagine. We like to market campaigns, in the business world of, hey, be an individual, buy this product. It's not that easy. Those are superficial, and forgive me for this language, but I'm pulling from, what's his name, Frankfurt, and also the Canadian philosopher Vervaeke, to say that, these are bullshit answers, right? These are distractions from the real challenge of being an authentic individual. But if you are bold enough to try to struggle with authenticity, right? Being unique in a moment of unprecedented choice and in a moment of unprecedented uncertainty, if you are willing to wrestle with that, what is going to be your reward? Ironically, you are going to be at greater risk for alienation, right? You are going to be at risk for greater alienation, right? Separateness. Why? Because most humans coming at it with these metaphysical tendencies to want to find an overarching simple answer to the complexity of existence, that humans with this kind of social mammalian evolutionary biology, want to cling together. And so if you dare to dance your own dance on the dance floor of existence in this moment, which is the challenge, which is the way to bring some kind of dignity and nobility to your own individual existence in this moment, if you dare to do your own dance, what will be your reward? Well, a few of us are going to look you in the eye and we're going to smile and we're going to nod and we're going to thank you. But there's going to be a lot of haters, and you should expect that. And we're going to expect to deal with alienation on the part of the crowd or the herd of humans who have not been willing yet or who have not had the strength yet to confront these philosophical challenges. And again, in this moment, I have to go off on a little complexity here and just say that there are senses in which this is a kind of an analysis of something that might be thought of as kind of a bourgeois problem. It's kind of a first world problem, and in whatever sense that you take from that, right? Like, this is a lucky problem, because a lot of people are dealing with classism and sexism and racism in ways that are incredibly real still. And so they haven't yet maybe had the chance even to get to this moment of unprecedented freedom in their lives. But I want to sort of defend this as worth wrestling with, in the sense that while I completely am sympathetic to these larger challenges and ongoing sort of projects of modernity, of critiquing society so that we can live up to our ideals, I also want to tie that to this postmodern challenge and say, if we're keeping it really real, we need to live up to these ideals and to continue to fight la lucha, the good fight, in order to expand these ideals in a moment where, if we're honest, we can't pretend these ideals are just the truth. We have to recognize the contingency and chosen nature of the ideals that we are choosing to fight for. And for a lot of people, that's going to take the wind out of their sails at first. Nietzsche has a way of talking about this that I think is really powerful, and I'll get to that in my next lecture. But here, what I've tried to do, and what I hope isn't coming across on some kind of too loose rant, is try to describe for you the way in which existential philosophy emerges in the 19th century out of a kind of an existential condition. And I've described that existential condition as a kind of a perfect storm of unprecedented levels of choice meet unprecedented levels of uncertainty about the direction of our existence and about the important questions of ethics, how to be a good, how to have a good life and how to be a good person. And out of this perfect storm collision of unprecedented levels of choices that have been brought to you by some of these modern ideals of classical liberalism and capitalism, we have found unprecedented levels of uncertainty, and we have found, in some sense, a new existential challenge. How will you try to be you in this moment? If you are really keeping it real, you're going to have to admit there's no playbook for your existence. And so we're going to focus on this idea of freedom and choice in existential philosophy. And we're going to see how, that the flip side of the coin of freedom is responsibility. Right? And that responsibility in some sense manifests like a bit of a burden. It's like when those bills start coming to you, right, with your name on it, right? The good news is maybe you're more free to make your choices. The bad news is now you are increasingly responsible for all of your choices. And again, the larger picture here is there's no playbook. And increasingly we're coming to grips with the possibility that there's no playbook for this. And so this kind of existential condition is being described by the existential philosophers in all their different ways of doing it. And let's add one more layer here, and that is that in some sense, maybe we're living in a time where we're coming to grips with our mortality, not only as individuals, but as a species in an unprecedented way before, as the master narratives of the past, which so often sort of tied the deeds of this life to the possibility of a sort of a continued existence in forever. We live in a moment where those master narratives, while they are still viable individual faith-based choices, it's just that, right? In some sense, even this makes this wonderful point about existential philosophy. Faith has become increasingly a choice, right? It's no longer sort of the default norm to such an extent in society that the individual has no choice about it. Good news, you live in a time of unprecedented religious freedom. Bad news, you live in a time of unprecedented religious freedom, which means that, again, the dark side of that is that doubt comes in, new challenges to faith-based existence come in the modern and then now the postmodern in an unprecedented way. And so what I want to do from this kind of basis of talking about existential philosophy that I think Kierkegaardian thinking in the early 19th century and then Nietzschean thinking in the late 19th century really set the stage for the blossoming of this in the 20th century. I want to do this kind of again in 2 lectures, the continuation of this one and talking about Soren Kierkegaard, and then in my next lecture, the talking about the way in which Friedrich Nietzsche figures into this picture. And one of the reasons why I've chosen over the years to stick with these 2 figures, you know, a couple things I'll say about it. It might seem strange for me to still be pulling from the 19th century. But again, I've tried to make the argument that I think that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche in their own ways are sort of just the first to the party on this. You know, they didn't get a lot of popularity in their lifetime for their ideas, but now every bookstore in the developed world, you know, has books by Kierkegaard and on Kierkegaard and books by Nietzsche and on Nietzsche, and most major university philosophy departments will discuss these as influential figures. Why? Because they had their finger on the pulse of something before other people did. And so in some sense, I'm trying to argue that I think a lot of the ideas that are going to come out of Kierkegaard that I'll develop and the ideas that are going to come out of Nietzsche that I will develop are ideas that still offer us an apt description of the existential challenge of living in this now 21st century moment. You know, Nietzsche, it was, you know, a kind of was a really bright guy, and he was kind of very bold in his statements, but it believed a lot in his own thinking. And so at times it's in some sense hard not to admire this for me, but he said, I'm telling you the future of I'm unpacking the history of the next 200 years. You know, so he's writing that at the end of the 19th century. And in some sense, I think he was boldly right in some sense that some of the themes of his philosophy are things that we're still wrestling with. In fact, I've had a colleague who's argued with me for years that if anything, Nietzsche just understated that it's going to take us longer to wrestle with some of the implications of this postmodern moment than even Nietzsche thought, in saying that we would wrestle with them just for a couple of centuries. Okay, and the other reason why I wanted to stick in this lecture series to these figures here, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, is that I'm lumping them both sort of as figures under this larger umbrella of existential philosophy. I've tried to make the case for that a little bit in my introduction here. But also that one of the things that I like about doing a lecture both on Kierkegaard and on Nietzsche is that in some sense, I see them as wrestling with related issues, but doing it in a way, a very different framework, in some sense, a very different vocabulary. And so what you're going to see is that Kierkegaard is what we call a theistic, an existential theist or a theistic existentialist, right? He is going to use the language of faith and God, and specifically work very much within the tradition that he inherits, which is Protestant Christianity, to develop these themes. And I hope that you hear that there will be kind of some irony in that, and he's going to generate a pretty radical theology that I think in some context is called a kind of a Kierkegaardian Christianity, and it's going to be a highly individualized version of Christian theology. But still, the language that he's going to employ to deal with these existential themes will be theistic language in the way he's going to advocate for a leap of faith and advocate for a leap of faith towards the divine or God. Although I think that in many respects, he's got a kind of a radical theology, and I'll give you my reading on that in that part of the lecture. But then Nietzsche, right, in the second part of the 19th century, is sort of infamously atheistic in the language that he uses to address these, what I'm arguing, same existential themes that confront the individual in a certain new, let's call it postmodern moment of existence. And so Nietzsche is not only atheistic, he's kind of infamous in the way that he phrases that. And you may be familiar with the the idea that Nietzsche has put forth as the death of God in the modern era, and how we need to wrestle with that. I think that for a lot of people who are going to relate more to the language of Kierkegaard and the theistic kind of framework for existence that still uses the language of faith and God, you're going to find that language upsetting and objectionable, especially on the surface of it. I totally get it. I think Nietzsche did that on purpose in some sense, because he's an iconoclast. He's a person who's trying to really kind of shatter some worldviews. And the way I think about it, I'm a bit of an apologist for Nietzsche, is that he's one of those teachers, right, that thinks he's got to get in your face. He's one of those coaches that thinks he's got to get in your face every once in a while. He's one of those thinkers that believes that sometimes what we need is a slap in the face, not literally, but conceptually. We need to be confronted by language that is incendiary and that is over the top and hyperbolic, and poetically, metaphorically over the top. Why? Because we kind of need to be shocked out of a stupor that we tend to be in part, no small measure, because of our metaphysical tendencies, our speculative tendencies as the kind of creature we are, and our social mammalian tendencies to kind of cling together into herd-like frameworks. Nietzsche thinks that he actually is a little bit of elitist in the sense that maybe Plato was kind of elitist, right, earlier in the tradition. He doesn't think he's speaking to many people. He thinks he's speaking to the bold few who are maybe going to have the courage to peer into this nihilistic abyss and come through the anxiety and despair that will induce, and have this kind of tragic optimism in the form of this vision of the Übermensch that he develops. But I'll deal with that when I get to my 20th lecture in this series on Nietzsche. So I think what I'd like to do actually is pause the lecture here and let this sort of stand alone as an introduction to existential philosophy. And then I'm going to generate a kind of a separate lecture on Kierkegaard, which I'll somehow spin into still being 19 in this lecture series. And then I'm going to generate a standalone lecture on Nietzsche as well. So hopefully this lecture hasn't been too despairing and hasn't produced too much anxiety. In some sense, I hope that it maybe just allows us to feel what many of us are already reporting feeling, which is that life in the 20th and 21st century has some brand new challenges. And I've tried to account for a little of that with a kind of a historical context for you in the way that the existential philosophers have tried to account for this. And now what I'm going to try to do is give you the more specific analysis of the thinkers Kierkegaard and Nietzsche in my next lectures. So thank you.